Good morning and salam sejahtera. The Honorable Dato Dr. Haji Muhammad Yusuf Haji Abdal, Academician Dato Dr. Tunku Azman, Professor Dr. Ahmed Nouri, Puan Hazami, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me thank ASM and ASA for enabling our team to undertake this very important study for ASEAN. I think it's very timely with the post-normal times, as you heard this morning. And I'll go a little bit more in detail on some of the challenges for ASEAN and the way forward. But I also like to thank Tan Sri Mazlan, our ASM analysts and Sunway analysts, Professor Pervez Ahmed and Professor Shanta, who's here, and many other experts in the ASEAN region that journeyed with us in this study for the last 2 years. So thank you very much. I think this study would not be possible without all your assistance, insights, and the debates and the discussions that we had. I'd also like to wish our Malaysians a happy Deepawali. I'm still in a Deepawali mood. so let me start. I think this is a very important discussion, and I'm going to take you through some of the key insights that we had. I think the video captured some of the key essence of what this study is about, but I want to take you deep dive on some of the key issues so that you'll be able to have a lot more deeper discussions in the next 2 days. So here, this is what I'm going to cover in the next 40 to 45 minutes. When we started, we looked at the global challenges, and we came across this post-normal times and very interesting concept, and we built it into our study. And we looked at the global perspective, but also we took a historical perspective of ASEAN. The kind of in 1967 when ASEAN was emerged, and the challenges and the kind of transformation that ASEAN took over the last, from 67 to now. And then we looked at some of the key issues and challenges, and then we said, look, how do we, as scientists, how do we capture this information in a very systematic way so that we can make sense? There's a lot of moving parts, right? As you see later on, the notion of complexity, chaotic, and so on. So we looked at a framework. Being scientists, you need to have very solid theoretical and empirical background to make solid decisions based on evidence. And then we looked at, using that framework, we looked at the ASEAN current STIE. You probably know STI, Science, Technology, Innovation, but Malaysia is unique. Under the 12th Malaysia Plan, we embedded science, technology, innovation, and economic development. It's one of the first countries that actually embedded that, because you can't decouple science, technology from the economy. So we will take a look at the current state, and then we look at some of the future scenarios. As you see, the world is changing at a rapid pace. What are the possible scenarios? And we saw earlier in the video the 4 key scenarios. Although in our work we had more than 4 scenarios, but with the consultations across the region, we brought it down to 4. And then we will explore what it takes for ASEAN to be a global powerhouse, right? We have the North American Free Trade Area, European Union, but we see that Asia is where the happening is, and how does ASEAN carve a place for itself? So let's review what post-normal times are and look at the global trends and how those global trends are impacting ASEAN and how ASEAN is reacting. So this is chaos. You probably heard this term. Really, and we're also seeing a very complex world, many moving parts. And what is really interesting is that we see a lot of contradictions. You go one direction, on one hand you see that free trade is great, but then you have tariffs, right? You have a whole host of, challenges that we face. So we clearly see that it's really uncertainty and confusing for policymakers, for planners, for industries. Where do we go? I mean, 2 years ago, everybody was on this, green movement. But last 8 months, everybody's backpedaling, right? So how do we navigate this through? And I think the speaker mentioned about global governance, right? How do we manage this complexity, right? So here are some of the global challenges that face global communities and also ASEAN. This image should tell you where we are, right? We have major challenges that impact all of us. Biodiversity loss, climate change. By the way, I'm a climate change refugee too. My house I lived in a place for 60 years. In the last 4 years, my house was flooded twice. If you're in Klang, Shalam area, every time when it rains, you get worried. 2 days ago, it was heavy rain. I was worried. Jesus, is this going to be a flooded Deepavali, right? We have health pandemics, and I'll talk about the links between them. Energy issues, energy transition, how do we move towards cleaner energy? There are changing demographics, particularly within ASEAN. We're starting to see rapid technological change, AI, and job security. How do we bring in pro-social AI in all our development? We're seeing geopolitical instabilities, regional conflicts, some of it closer at home. We're also seeing tariffs. How do we react to this? Food and clean water, many places, this is still a challenge even within ASEAN. Governance challenges, I think the speaker mentioned, at the highest level right up to the community levels. While GDP in many countries have been increasing, we are seeing the gaps are widening too. Corporations are making billions of dollars, but people are losing jobs. This is the contradictions that we are seeing, right? And how do we build that inclusive growth? I think earlier mentioned no one is left behind. How do we ensure that? Because otherwise, if they are left behind, they will be on the streets. So we're starting to see this. More closer to home, right? We did a major study on biodiversity in ASEAN. We're seeing this Anthropocene, where humans are playing a big role in changing the planetary health systems. We're seeing in many places forest fires, a whole host of things. But the major challenge is that we're starting to see how climate impact disease, both communicable and non-communicable diseases. I think recently we did a study on planetary health. We show how planetary health has an impact on Malaysia's GDP. It shaves 5% of our GDP, close to 70 to 80 billion ringgit. That's double our fuel subsidy, right? So it's a major impact, right? And we're seeing drug-resistant TB and a whole host of things. This is the report card of SDGs. The ASEAN one looked no different, right? So many of the SDGs we have not met. This is a more recent study. It just came out in September. We have 9 planetary health boundaries. We just breached the 7th one, right? So we are continuing to breach the planetary health boundaries. This is a study by World Economic Forum. What are the big challenges for economies? 2 years, of course, your issues related to misinformation. But 10 years down the road, you see the first 4 risks are all related to climate. And this is where we see that economic development must align to the planetary health conditions. So a lot of our ASEAN study built around how do we harness the natural resources of ASEAN. Here again, policy crisis, the knock-on effect of climate change across the board. So this is a massive impact. This is what complex, this is what chaotic is. How do we unpack this complexity? Why are we in this mess, right? If you see, I was in Rotterdam recently on the Planetary Health Summit. This whole notion of Anthropocene humans having an impact. But actually, if you see who's responsible, it's not only humans, but actually it should be referred to as corporacine. It's the corporates that play a key role in driving this. We're seeing this across the board where our economic development is a zero-sum development model. What do I mean by that? Our economies have grown at the expense of the environment. I think ASM did a study under Science Outlook. We show actually Malaysia's GDP has gone up, but our STI ecosystem has not changed much, but actually our environment has degraded. But this is true for most of the ASEAN economies. You'll see later. I'll show you the numbers. So most of our economic development follows a zero-sum development model. And this, you'll see, is not sustainable. Here's another recent data that shows who do we follow? Where do we get all our development models? You know, we run this workshop on return on values. Who do we blame? Actually, we should be blaming the business schools and the universities because we tell them, go and maximize your profits. In all the business schools, we say, go and maximize your profits. That's exactly what they did. There's return on investment and short term. Where do they, so if you see factors of production, land, labor, capital. And then, of course, they have a total factor productivity, which is something that most people don't know what that is. They call it technology. Where is environment feature in all this? So you'll see that the thinking now is not just return on investment, but return on values, which I'll talk about. This is what zero-sum development model, a recent study that show that, you know, the big so on the vertical axis, you have economic development. Horizontal is how much you overshoot your planetary health boundaries. Guess what? Who are the biggest culprits? You see way on the right there? Canada, Australia, US, right? Guess who all the developing countries are following? Everybody wants to be rich. Everybody wants to be a developed country. That's what we mean by the developed country model, which is zero-sum. So ASEAN need to reinvent itself to break away from the zero-sum development model, right? So is there an alternate model? So what we see here is that this is the model where we are growing our economy at the expense of the planet. We are climbing on the wrong curve. Is there an alternate model? The answer is yes. How do we shift the whole game? That is both the planet and the economy can thrive. And that's what this ASEAN Foresight study is about. We need to look at a different model compared to the traditional neoclassical base economic development. We talked about chaos, complexity, and contradiction. As scientists, we need to sit down and understand what this is. Chaos, there are many things happening, but we need to have clarity of what are the key factors that are driving this. Complexity, chaos needs to be addressed with great clarity. Complexity, we need to be creative. Yes, the systems are complex. We are smart people, right? We need to start devising new solutions. We've got to find new ways of doing things. And contradiction, sometimes we go in different directions. And this is where we see that collaboration, co-designing, and co-creating is really important. And you'll see in this study, we show that for ASEAN to manage chaos, complexity, and contradiction, collaboration, co-creation, and co-designing is critical. So let's look at ASEAN development. We have achieved a lot. Although it's really small, we try to get a historical perspective. You know, more details are in the report, so stay tuned for Friday, right? But just some key highlights. Over the many years, we have slowly defined what ASEAN community is, right? We also have regional cooperation, at least ASEAN free trade. Over the many years, we've got free trade arrangements with other groupings over the many years. There's a major push for FDIs, but we need to start thinking about the quality of FDIs that come in, right? Regional digitization and AI strategy, we're starting to move in that direction, some faster than others. The fifth dot point is economic development versus planetary health. And this is where we need to start rethinking our calibration. How do we do this? And some, good initiatives are in place, the ASEAN Sustainability and Green initiatives that are in place. So over the many years, I think there is some progress. But can we do better? Okay. The answer is yes. ASEAN actually, there's tremendous potential. This was done about a year ago, 690 million people. 2025 is 700 million. It's a formidable powerhouse in terms of population. So we see that population growth is phenomenal. Right? After India and China, ASEAN collectively is the next powerhouse, right? If we stay united. Again, we see that GDP is the third largest collectively, so tremendous potential. Cultural diversity. You'll see later on when I show the map of the triple 10, the diversity in economics is amazing. We have a lot of talent, growing demand. Some of the countries, the youth population is fairly high. And there is some geopolitical advantage because it's been fairly stable and it's the middle of, everywhere. So very fertile place. So how do we build this ASEAN strategy? Looking at the experience, I think Tengku mentioned, looking at what we did in Malaysia, looking at the Foresight 2050, a whole host of work that ASM did. And we said, okay, how do we bring the technology, the economic development, and the global forces together? And that's what this study is. Right? So the framework that we use, being scientists, is that the following. We did the forensics, that means taking stock of everything that we can measure, everything that we can capture. And then we tried forecasting some of the trends, And then we started foresighting, testing different possibilities, and then future proving. The future that will give us the best potential and the ecosystem that we need to develop today to achieve that outcome. So you'll see 4 paradigm shifts and so on. I will go through how we came up with those things. So we had a fair bit of consultation over the last 2 years with a number of people within the ASEAN region. We started with Malaysia for the 12th Malaysia Plan, as mentioned earlier. We looked at the global technology. By the way, we started foresighting in 2014, 2015, looking at the global trends. And we worked with ASM, our team worked with ASM, and we looked at the economic sectors in Malaysia. Because oftentimes we see the scientists have their own scientific endeavor, but it's sometimes not linked to the economy. So we looked at what are the key economic sectors in Malaysia. And then we looked at the technology. This was done in 2015, 2016. Do you know that Malaysia was still rolling out, haven't started 4G, but we already saw others doing 5G and 6G on experimental basis, right? The kind of disruptions. So we looked at a whole host of technology in 2015, 16. And of course, there's a lot of sub-technologies. So these are the 10 global technology, and within them, the sub-technology. So we've got the economic sectors, we've got the technology. We put this together, and we actually showed that how, when we bring the two together, how the technology shapes the economic development. So if you look at agriculture, If agriculture is to move up the value chain, do the agriculture sector use all these technologies, embed all this technology? The answer is that when we look at many of the agriculture plan before, bits of pieces here and there, but it's not an integrated. Similarly, when we look at 5G or spectrum technology, yes, we have people developing it, but the application is not derived. So both the horizontal and vertical was not fully integrated. And that's what the 12th Malaysia Plan tried to do. And all our grants then built on, if you are doing agriculture research, how do you use this technology? How do you create better value? So this is still 2 dimensions. So then we started seeing, this is 2017, 2018, we saw the 12th Malaysia Plan. During that period, so many things happened, a lot of global things, the pandemic and so on. Then we realized, actually, you know what? There are major global forces that are at play. They were shaping the technology and they were shaping the economic sectors, right? And we started studying those global technologies, global forces. We saw science and technology with AI and industrial age. We saw health and well-being coming out of the pandemic. Economic dynamics were changing, with tariffs and a whole host. So we saw 10 global forces that were shaping the world that we live in, right? Demographics, education, the type of educational delivery, and so on. The nature of competitiveness was changing. We also looked at the 10 STI drivers. What we started in 2016, 2017, more recently we're starting to see slight changes that were taking place. And the first 5 on top are all driving the digital world, right? From AI to complex systems. And then we see advanced new materials emerging in the bottom. So we see these 10 global technology, some refinements from our earlier work that we did. How do we do this? We look at all the patents and the future work. There's a fair bit of work that went in to look at this. We also looked at globally, what are the major sectors? This is globally, but you can do that for every country. And we did it for ASEAN countries. Extractive industry is going to be really important. 4 years ago, we see now in Malaysia and others, rare earth is a major issue, right? Because our electronics and our solar panels are all driven. So these are the major economic sectors. Okay? So we put them together. Guess what? We're starting to see strong endogenous relationship between them. Technology, driving sectors, and that's having an impact on the forces of change, so the complexities, phenomena. So how do we unpack this complexity? Remember we spoke about complex, right? To unpack the complexity, we need to unpack these 3 important dimensions, right? So we looked at the global, so we've been continuously tracking the global, and then we looked at ASEAN countries. What were the forces that shape the ASEAN? Can I get a water? So 10 ASEAN countries, the economic structures are very different. So we try to combine. So then we say global forces are the same, but the economic sectors vary. So we looked at collectively ASEAN economic sectors, professional services, and so on. By the way, we can do this for all 10 ASEAN countries. But we just, for this report, we put it together collectively. But again, we see that each of those technologies has important applications. And each of those sectors need to use these technologies. And we build this 10 for ASEAN, how the global forces are shaping. So I want to take you through the forces that are shaping ASEAN. So we went a little bit more deep dive. Population dynamics. We're seeing some of the ASEAN countries are aging population, right? That's got major impact on pension funds, major impact on many other industries. We also see a lot of inter-ASEAN migration, right? Health demographics, biodiversity issues, and I'll go more deeper into the numbers. Food and water security, access to energy, these are the key forces that are shaping both technology and the economic sectors. The nature of competitiveness is also changing. Market structure, sociological and market structure, education and skills. You see that, today we have education that are broad-based. You can get education from most places. So many universities are struggling today, right, if they can't create value. Governance, political stability across the globe, and even within ASEAN, there are some challenges. And the last one is about equity and equality. How do we balance national growth versus, the different, communities that are living? How do we avoid that widening of knowledge and education and income gaps? So here are some numbers you'll see in the report that we show the aging population. Some of the aging population, some of the economies are going to be facing the aging economy. So what do? Do you bring in more migrant, more immigration to keep, like what Japan and others are doing? So again, or do you increase the birth rates? So these are some of the challenges, and there are consequences. Each of those changes has consequences for ASEAN. The same thing with surge of youth. How do we create jobs for youth? The kind of education, training, population mobility is going to be really important, particularly rural, urban, between developed and developing ASEAN economies. Health demographics. This is, as we see climate change and environmental degradation, we're starting to see increase in communicable and non-communicable diseases. I just saw, we are doing a project on dengue. You should see the dengue numbers. Because of the temperature increase, that's having an impact on the mutations, right? The same thing with TB and a whole host of other health challenges. Interestingly, we are also starting to see that how environmental pollution is starting to increase inflammation and disruption of our endocrine systems and diabetes and heart disease and a whole host of other challenges, right? This is linked to our biodiversity. We're seeing, many parts of ASEAN, loss of forest cover, pollution. We just did a big study on blue economy, planetary health. We see this is, and also biodiversity in ASEAN. I think 2022 we did a study which showed there are some challenges for ASEAN. Food and water security, so they're all interlinked, right? Because environment has an impact on crops and food and clean water. Energy is also another important. We see, while many countries are still very much dependent on fossil fuel, now there's a push towards renewable energy. What would happen to countries that are very dependent on fossil fuels, right? And also access to cheaper energy. So again, we have things such as data centers and so on that requires a lot of energy. Where is this energy going to come from? So although ASEAN does have an energy system, how do we transition towards renewable energy? Who's going to pay for this? There are also issues related to economic dynamics and competitiveness. We're seeing big corporations doing very well, but 95 to 98% of most economic development is driven by SMEs. And many SMEs are still struggling, right? And of course, coming out of the pandemic was a major challenge. How do we support the SMEs to move up the value chain? How do we make them become more digital? We did a study on, we had Industry 4.0. We asked, what is the level of adoption of Industry 4.0? Most industries are 2.5. They hardly have digital, So again, how do we bring them to AI and a whole host of other new technology, right? So again, how do we bring in this market mechanism within ASEAN which is increasingly becoming digital both regionally and globally, right? Other dynamics, we're starting to see the changing of consumer towards more values-driven. Very interesting. When I talk to SMEs, they tell that, it's very difficult to get workers. In Malaysia, we're doing this. This is because our workforce is very picky. They want to work for a company, particularly the young ones, want to work for a company where you have work-life balance, you have good ethical values, and so on. And one of the employers told me that when they interviewed a student, a Malaysian student, often the employer will ask questions. But after that, they ask, do you have any questions? The students today ask the employer, why do you deserve me? What value can you create for me to create value for you? We live in a TikTok culture and digital culture. The kids know more than the teachers, the employer. So we're seeing a completely different structure, different sociological dynamics that are happening, right? So again, increasing middle class within ASEAN. How do we meet those needs for education and a whole host of other, and of course, e-commerce. And as I mentioned earlier, whole chunk of industries still have not embraced digitization. Education skills are really important. Again, we see that, the type of education people get. We see across ASEAN that we have a lot of them with university education, but can't find jobs, right? Do education meet the needs of industry? So again, these are key things that we see. I think Malaysia is going through education reform, and also I think we did the higher education, similar issues crop up. It's about skill sets of the future, right? And also moving towards, one of the big challenges that firms have today is that not enough sustainability officers, not enough people that understand planetary health. This is where the future is going to be. Yeah. So there are some gaps, right? We spoke about governance and political stability. There are some challenges within ASEAN, right? As you see, there are regional touch points that we need to manage. And maybe the discussion, how do we manage our own regional conflicts? How do we manage global players that see ASEAN as a key player, key part for positioning themselves. So again, if ASEAN itself is not strong, it's going to be hard. It's going to be influenced externally. So again, issues related to political stability, territorial sovereignty, and also civil liberty within ASEAN. Equality, and this is something that's really important, where as the nation grows, how do we ensure everyone within the economy and within society are not left behind? We're starting to see gaps widen, particularly among indigenous population and population, rural areas and so on. So again, how do we manage these challenges? The other big issue is actually how do we grow our economy without having an adverse impact on the environment. This donut economy, the new model which is about regenerative economy, which talks about economic development with planetary health boundaries. If you see, most developed countries have breached their planetary health boundaries, right? But if you see, ASEAN is getting there too. Some of the ASEAN, although this data is 2022, right? We're starting to see we are getting there. ASEAN is starting to breach, and Malaysia has breached 6 out of the 9 planetary health boundaries, right? So we are growing our economy, at the expense of the environment. So where do we go from here? So what we did was that this is the forensics that we took stock of where we are, the forces that are shaping. And then we looked at what are the possibilities, the different scenarios. We had the first scenario is actually misplaced confidence. Everything is honky-dory, everything is great, we are all doing okay, right? And let's see what happens, right? Then we have the alternate one, which is actually the haves and the have-nots. And you'll see that there are countries and agents that are doing very well, others are left behind. What happens under those scenarios? And the third scenario is not a good scenario, which is spiraling out of control. Right? This is where environmental degradation, health issues, people are not happy, and so on. Ideally, how do we get to the collective prosperity? So we did the simulation, but that depends on the state of our STI ecosystem. If our STI ecosystem is robust and solid, we see that we can navigate through these challenges. How do we define this STI ecosystem? We needed a framework, right? So we used a framework that ASM is very familiar. It's very easy to remember, right? We use this ADA ecosystem. You know, when we say ecosystem, we need to be able to define what those enablers of the ecosystem. So the first one is actually infrastructure. This is our physical and natural infrastructure, how good and solid they are. We can measure that. The second one is our infrastructure, the level of digital utilization, adoption. The third one is intellectual capital. This is the talent, the ability to absorb knowledge, adapt, and innovate. The fourth one is integrity system. This is our governance system. Policy, planning, implementation, tracking, incentives to drive collective prosperity. Leadership is critical. You see that I think one of the speakers mentioned the lack of leadership, breaks down governance and everything else. Not just at the national, global level, but at the national level, at the corporate level, leadership is critical. And we have an empirical work that shows that institutional leadership is the most important driver, right? Interaction, the partnerships and linkages between different players in the ecosystem, and internationalization, how firms, countries react to international regulations, standards, and markets. So we had very detailed measurements for this, and we mapped those 10 ASEAN countries. And we looked at, and details are there in the report. Every country, we actually mapped them in the state of development. Of course, Singapore is way ahead. It's a small country, but yet, not much natural resources, but they built a robust ecosystem. Then we have the other countries which are maturing, and the last one is actually emerging economies. A lot of good natural resources, but needs a lot of work in terms of developing the STI ecosystem. So, yes, we have a vision, but we need to understand our STI ecosystem. So, the state of development is very much dependent on the state of the ecosystem enablers. So now what we did was that using that, we started simulating, right? Can we achieve those utopia, this collective prosperity? Here are the 4 scenarios you saw earlier in the video, right? The first one is actually misplaced. Oh, everything is great. The second one is have and have-nots, and we see the gaps within ASEAN. Within each country, we also see the gaps. We also see spiraling out of control, environmental degradation, health issues, economic. Ideally, we want to get to the collective prosperity. So we simulated several dynamics, and we show that the first one is actually what we call, misplaced confidence. Everything is honky-dory. But we see that when that happens, we see that limited funding is put in within ASEAN, and we see that the bigger countries, the countries that are left behind, are going to have a major impact, and that has got spillover impact across ASEAN. The classic example is haze, right? All of us had to face haze because these are transboundary issues. So we see that, everything is honky-dory will ultimately lead to the spiraling out of control. So the simulation actually shows this. The other one is haves and the have-nots. We see the more richer, countries with richer communities, and the left behind, that too is not great. Because you're going to see unhappy people, that are going to be on the streets. We're seeing across the board, not just in ASEAN, but across the globe, where people are unhappy with, inequities. That's also not good. Alternatively is that we simulated the case where, when I mean EP means you give your resources to external players. That means that you outsource everything to external players. And oftentimes what happens is that they take a short-term perspective, right? Extract as much as you can and then leave it barren, right? So yes, FDIs are very important, but the choice of FDI is also really important, right? So we have a lot of data centers, but where are we going to get the electricity and the water? Right? It's going to crowd out, other local industries. So we see that the misplaced confidence that everything is okay can lead to that gaps and eventually leading to the spiraling out of control. Well, what's the solution? Here's the solution. We simulated with the experts on the ground. Yes, we have haves and the have-nots, but we shift. Yes, the external players are really important, but we put in regulatory architecture and incentives for the transfer of knowledge to local systems, local supply chain. So we got to create an environment within our local ecosystem to be able to absorb, adapt, and innovate. So the ecosystem needs to be prepared. So yes, FDIs are very important. The quality of FDIs are important to build a more resilient supply chain. So while leading organizations are providing the leadership, but they also ensure the spillover impact across the supply chain. That's really important. We see in some countries that's what they did. They got a few anchor companies, but they made sure that they build the supply chain, the local supply chain, and piping it into the global supply chain. So the knowledge transfer from the external players and the economic agents in the ASEAN, member states are really important. The other one is also misplaced. That can also move forward through pushing that if we don't do anything, you're going to end up in the spiraling. So how do ASEAN collectively mobilize resources? Whether ASEAN Sovereign Fund, I think Tunku mentioned about what Malaysia is doing, ASEAN funding to support STI developments, not just in the developed, but also in the maturing and the emerging states. So this is ASEAN self-developing its own ecosystem. So two broad, and both needs to collectively come. We're building our own ecosystem, but at the same time, bringing in and learning from others. We can bring foreign players, but if the ecosystem is not ready, you'll see that the build-up of local supply chain is not going to happen, right? So we see that the preparation of the ecosystem enablers are really important. So what we see here is that, what are the possible scenarios? We see that, collective prosperity is the most desirable, but difficult to achieve. Because bringing all the ASEAN countries together is not an easy, because everybody is diverse. But, spiraling out of control is the least desirable, but we can easily gravitate towards that, right? But what we see is that both have and have-nots are not desirable, but most likely. So these are the possibilities of the outcome. So which means that the collective effort needs to be within ASEAN to be able to develop the ASEAN STI ecosystem collectively and across all the member states to achieve those collective prosperity. So here are some of the key things that we saw. 2020 to 2035 is a critical juncture for ASEAN. This is the inflection point. The numbers show this. If we don't make the transition now, I think it's going to be late, right? If we don't make the change, ASEAN will spiral out of control, right? So we really need to push very hard during this period to really build the STI ecosystem across the ASEAN. So this is where the Green Initiative, building the transportation grid, the energy grids are going to be really important. So we see that if we don't do it, that misplaced confidence and have nots will lead to spiraling out of control. So how do we get there? How do we get to the collective prosperity? And that's what this study maps out. So what are the challenges? What are the things that we need to do? Here are some of the mindset shifts, the paradigm shifts, right? One is that move from the profit-oriented to the values-driven, return on values. You know, ROI takes a short-term perspective, ROV takes a long-term perspective. But what is really interesting is that if you're able to show your value proposition, your return on investment increases. So we show that prosperity is seen in a different light. Second one is people. How do we invest into people? Because we see that some parts of ASEAN is aging. Others, you still have a large, huge youth. How do we develop collectively for ASEAN? Planetary health is going to be very important. I'm so glad that Malaysia is the first country in the world that actually came up with a planetary health. Do you know that we did an assessment, the studies online, that ASEAN's natural biodiversity is about 2.7 trillion annually contribute to GDP, right? Partnership is really critical for this mindset change. But this needs to be anchored on the global forces, our ecosystems, you know, and the forces that are transforming ASEAN. If ASEAN is able to, at the present moment, ASEAN STI ecosystem is kind of, some countries are stronger than others, so collectively we are not that strong, right? So our engagement with the global world collectively is relatively not strong, right? But if we build this ecosystem, ASEAN collectively is strong. It could have the leverage to engage with other groupings at a higher value chain. So this is why it's really important, and this is where we see that ASEAN playing a dominant role through STIE in driving this change. So the growth of ASEAN will only take place if we're able to build the STI in each country and across ASEAN interlinked. That's how we get out of the poly crisis and transform the poly crisis into poly opportunities. And you'll see that there are a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of climate issues, but there are a lot of opportunities for new industries. To do that, to shift that game, as I said earlier, shifting, there's a few things, fundamental shifts that needs to happen within the ASEAN framework. One is that really building the STI ecosystem. I'm so glad Malaysia actually started the RDICE that looks at the whole value chain carefully. Again, that needs to be done across ASEAN. Second one is actually about the behavioral change. Thinking collectively. Actually, ASEAN countries compete on the same space. How do we collectively look at ASEAN, the whole supply chain? And the world is changing. How do we continuously do the foresighting, transformation? As I said, you know, we did the foresight 5 years, but now we're doing every 2 years. You know, the industries, the technology is changing. So this needs to happen. So the first fundamental change is actually the STI enable. We really need to look at each of these enablers of the ecosystem in each country and develop it and interlink it. Second one is actually about the behavioral shift. It's really shifting towards, at the highest level of cooperation, coherence, and also cohesion. How do we bring that in our policies across ASEAN and across the countries in a more holistic way? And continuously foresighting, looking at global shifts, how it impacts ASEAN economies, how it impacts industries, and feeding back that loop, that's continuous loop that we are continuously, and this is where the foresighting exercise within each country and within ASEAN is going to be really important. To do this, we said the three major things, but to enable this, these three fundamental actions, we see that collective prosperity, we see there's a few key enabling things that can be done. One is, you know, integrated supply chains. You know, we saw that the war and others, COVID disrupted the supply chain, rethinking our supply chain. Frictionless trading, financial trading, harmonizing standards. There's a lot of standards that are very different. How do we harmonize that? There's some progress happening. A lot more push towards open source ecosystem. I know sharing of information, sharing of resources are going to be very important. And also, inclusive access to resources, education, training, collectively within the countries and across ASEAN. And I'm so glad that, the STIE that's done in Malaysia is being shared across. And I think we can learn from others. Push towards values-driven. What's ASEAN values? And incorporating that in all our policy framework. There needs to be common, constant monitoring. And this is something that is missing in many developing countries. They have plans, but there's not much monitoring, tracking, refinement. And also the last one is agility. This comes back to talent. Continuously developing the talent to future-proof the talent. So we see these global forces. We see the ecosystem would lead to 3 scenarios. But ASEAN needs to start thinking about the treasure it has, its biodiversity. And this is where we see that transitioning from that exploitative development model, the zero-sum, to a more regenerative, values-driven model. I'll show you some of the things. We did the assessment of what this planet-friendly industry valuation is globally. It runs into trillions of dollars. This is a more recent work that we did. And ASEAN alone, ASEAN's biodiversity alone generates 2.7 trillion USD, right? Generating a whole host of industries, right? So what was a poly crisis could lead to a poly opportunities. So summary, ASEAN can be a global powerhouse. So when I say return on values, it means that it's not just economic development. Yes, economic powerhouse is very important, but that needs to dovetail the socioeconomic development and also sustainability. That's what return on values are, right? And that's what drives this shift. The shift that is understanding the global forces, making the fundamental changes and the key enablers of the ecosystem to drive that mindset change at the highest level, percolating all the way down to, policy work. And we see that that's what values-driven is for ASEAN to really develop. We see that that values-driven mindset is so important. So to conclude, ASEAN's collective prosperity can only take place if ASEAN's SDI ecosystem development is orchestrated to continuously move up the global value chain. It has to be by design and not left to chance, right? And this is where the governments, the leadership is really important at all levels. Thank you very much.